Hi, this is Tom, and we're here talking with Ed and George at ROM-D in the Museum's Quarters. They're going to be doing a workshop this weekend, so I just figured I'd grab both of them and chat at them.
That's right. We will remain silent throughout, but you will just address us. We will nod silently. This will make a compelling podcast.
Yes.
Which is the worst for me, because I love talking, so just being talked at is like, I'm out of here.
But doesn't it charge you up? Isn't this how you get your energy?
No,
you don't absorb words from the outside and
that's basically just somebody telling me I'm not allowed to talk.
Okay, well, George, since you're talking anyway, who the hell are you anyway?
Who are you, George?
I'm not
who
Ed.
George.
So I'm
Backer?
not Ed.
The anti-Ed, I see.
I'm not Ed. I'm George Backer. I'm a games designer and producer, and I also write and stuff.
Isn't everyone a games designer and producer nowadays?
Well, yeah, but yes, that is correct.
Thanks, George.
No, but I have, a little bit more background. So I've been in the games industry I think the first professional game, the first big AAA game that I've worked on was Black and White, and that was released in 2002. I think I've been working, so I've spent about 11 years at Lionhead, from 2000 till 2011, and then I've left and made a couple of mobile games that had various degrees of success, in air quotes.
That's actually a euphemism for some have just disappeared without any trace at all.
Exactly, and now I'm working on a very cool game with a very cool team, and in that role, I'm a game director.
Oh, you mean the shopkeeper? Yes, thanks.
I've also done the shopkeeper with Tom.
Yeah, which everyone hates.
No, but at least it got released, so there you go.
And 99% of it is just getting something out the door.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
You made a game, brilliant. Congratulations. You got it released, absolutely fantastic.
Smashing.
That's all that anyone can hope for.
And then afterwards, people can complain about it. Like there are games in this world that have not been made that people can't even complain about, which is the saddest thing in the world.
It's the only way to have a 100% record is just never finish anything, never release anything.
The sad thing is, I know people.
Things remain in your head and they are perfect.
Sounds like a certain person we know that George may or may not have worked with.
You're talking about Ed now? That's really rude. That's really rude, Tom.
There's a British comedian, dead now, called Peter Cook, and he had an old joke to fashionable young arts people in a pub, and one says, "I'm writing a novel," and the other one says, "Neither am I." It's really easy to feel like you're part of a creative scene, but if you don't make anything, you're never proved wrong. You can always be just about to do a masterpiece. And it's really important to finish things and make things, and even if especially when they're terrible. And I think quite often I have wanted to just be good. I don't want to get less bad at something. I just want to go straight to being good. And there is no shortcut. You've got to be terrible, and there's a bit less terrible, and then not quite as bad, and then gradually...
Eventually gets good.
Yes, but you learn much more from finishing something than starting something.
So speaking of never doing anything, Ed, who are you anyway?
I'm Ed Stern. I'm a games writer and designer at Splash Damage in London, mainly doing multiplayer shooters, which are the one genre that requires no story or writing at all. So 80% of my day is spent trying to think of new ways for soldiers to go, "Grenade! Medic! They're over there! They really are over there, the enemies who we must shoot."
Do you have to find a new spin on Fire in the Hole? Or is that all done? Or is it like such a quote thing that you're not allowed to touch that one?
You oppress me with your question.
I'm sorry.
But between the two of us, because you worked on the movies and Fable and stuff, so we're both familiar with. I think there's a lot of confusion about what game writing is or what game writers do.
Yeah.
Well, for a start, lots of people, in fact, hardly anyone has made a game. And there's a lot of confusion about how games get made and what the process is and how long they take and what's easy and what's difficult. And I used to think that we as an industry and a medium did a very bad job of explaining this, and we must do better. And then realised that movies have been around for a century, everyone's kind of interested in them, and hardly anyone actually wants to know how they get made. Like, people love making of features, but those are very carefully made. That's not actually a tour of the sausage factory. That's the promotional video made by the sausage company. So very few people want to spend a day on set or a week in edit. And the people who do kind of find a way to do that, or that the information is out there and people talk about how a film production happened. But most people think that actors come up with their own lines. They don't really understand. They think the director edits the film. It's not true. That's not how movies get made. So it's unsurprising that people are not very well informed about how games get made, because they are made under conditions of panic and chaos that make it very unlikely that we're going to allow cameras to let people film us not knowing how we do our job. Which is my basic state of employment, is I do not know how to do my job and I feel stupid pretty much all of the time.
But it's most creative endeavours are like this, I think. And you mentioned, the film process, and I've recently rewatched this TV show called Project Greenlight. And the interesting thing there was it was a thing that came out, I think, in the 2000 and something, where it was an internet-wide competition. You could submit your script, and then Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, and Miramax would allow you to make that movie, essentially. And the interesting thing about this, it showed the sausage factory. So it showed the kind of that you've written the script, and then you walk as a first-time writer, you walk into that room with your script, and you hand it over to the line producer, who's the guy who budgets all the film and figures out what the film needs. The line producer says, no way we can shoot this for less than over budget. So suddenly you have to go and rewrite it. And then it shows all the different stages, like even a day on set where you're like, oh, it's raining. Well, that's bad, because this scene requires sunshine, so we have to go and rewrite everything.
Alternatively, there was some budget cuts to the BBC. There were always budget cuts to the BBC. And somebody was asked, so what impact is this going to have? And he said, well, I can tell you right now, there's no episode of Doctor Who is going to happen at night when it's raining. Because it's really expensive to shoot stuff on location and have to hire the rain unit as well. That's not going to happen. There's going to be a lot of episodes written indoors. And that, as a user, as a player, or as a consumer of a film, you don't care how expensive it was to make.
No.
It doesn't matter to you whether that was, it took them 4 years to get that shot or whatever. Just, is it fun and is it exciting and do you enjoy it?
And is it coherent? I mean, the best example from that Project Greenlight was actually, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, so if you want to listen to that show, if you want to see the show on TV, then just ignore me for the next 30 seconds. But there was one particular shot where the director and the director of photography both had this really elaborate, big crane shot that required a crew of 50 to build up this expensive rigging, scaffolding and whatnot, and it took a day to shoot, and at the end, and it was a really complicated shoot, and it involved sort of kids and stuntmen and all that stuff, and it was this elaborate shot that at the end looked a bit wonky, and then at the end, because it was just so complicated to do with all the conditions, and at the end the producer insisted just to do a backup shot, which is just that person walking along.
A really simple safety shot.
Very simple safety shot. At the end, the safety shot wasn't just a better technical shot, it was the better emotional shot. So suddenly but your budget just was reduced by about 80k, because, that big elaborate thing cost you 80k versus that 1000k shot. That's...
In French, because the movie industry is quite well established and the job descriptions are very stable. I mean, if someone from the 50s, went in a time machine and came today and looked at the credits of a film screen of a movie, they wouldn't understand what the CG was and all these thousands of people, working on computer graphics. But they'd go, okay, there was a director, there was a producer, there was a lighting, there was a director of photography. That's pretty stable.
Yeah.
And that's true whether it's digital photography or analog photography. But in French, the word isn't director, is it? It's réalisateur, like a realizer. And that's what you do. You take something, the potential for a story, and you realise it. You turn it into something real. There's an old Hollywood joke of what's the shortest phrase you can put in a script that will ensure that movie never gets made. And there was a kind of competition for who could come up with the shortest, most impossible one. And the winner was the fleets meet. So it's not just one huge composite special effect shot of load of model ships in a bath. It's another one as well. That's 3 words that completely sink your movie. And quite often when I talk to writers, whether either they're established writers and they're used to writing novels, or working in prose, or they've just never done any writing before, they don't realise that they keep on writing the fleets meet. It's like, and then 1,000 dragons land in the field of mirrors. Like, no, we can't do that.
Mirrors? No.
And it makes you realise. It makes you really appreciate other media, because there are something games do really well and easily. And my theory is that games and movies are absolute opposites. The most expensive thing in a movie is the cheapest thing in a game, and vice versa. So that the easiest, simplest effect in all of drama, really, is the human face reacting. And when you think of classic great Hollywood moments, it's amazing how many of them are someone reacting, listening and hearing, and there's a moment of realization. And the human face, a well-trained actor, beautifully lit, it's just amazing. We empathise through them. And this is something that goes right the way back to ancient Greek drama, is, we identify with them, we are purged through them. It started off as a very ritual, religious performance, whereby they would enact something and a lot of the terms that are used are still are Greek ones, none of which I can remember at this point. That's you get for free, even with a student theatre production. You get someone talking and someone listening. That's really expensive to do in games. Facial animation is the most expensive thing. It's amazing how much more expensive it is than, let's say, making a building fly around. For a movie, for a physical effect, to build a building and to fly it around or make it move, that's a big physical thing. It's really expensive. For us, once we've made something, it's not that much more difficult to make it fly around. Like helicopter shots, we get them for free because we don't use a physical camera. But everything is a prop. There's no locations. You can't go to a range of mountains and shoot an actor in front of them. You have to make the mountains. But then, because everything is digital, you can fly the camera around. You can. Bizarrely, the thing we can't do is focus. And for me, it's a very odd thing about photorealistic games and the way in which games have been led by technology to be as photorealistic as possible. So we're using more and more cinematic techniques, but we can't put one thing in focus and one thing not in focus. It's the most basic cinematic, photographic principle. The
depth of field and all that stuff.
Yeah,
in that sense, it's quite interesting because also what we. So I agree with everything you said, of course, because I also make games. So,
yes.
But the other thing, what I've also learned is that often even that freedom, though, to be able to do whatever you want, is actually quite hindering. Like in a way, when you talk to for example, camera operators and DOPs and the conditions they often have to work in. The limitations that they get.
It's the constraints that makes them creative.
They go like, hey, we couldn't do either budgetary constraints or like they don't have enough space to put an elaborate camera rig in there and all this stuff, or like you can't physically move a camera that way. Often makes them have to make better creative choices at the end, and also from a consistency point of view, like but they have had the tools for such a long time. That there's this sort of like hidden language that has been established that we as an audience understand. We don't know the rules of editing by heart. We don't know the exact rules, but we kind of like know when something is off when the editing. When two people talk and and it looks weird, then we know it looks weird. We don't know that, for example, the shots have been edited the wrong way or the camera's been crossed, but we know something is off.
The film editing, you don't have to know how the effect is created to have the effect work on you. And it is a visual language. There's an old story, which is probably not true, but it doesn't matter, about the World Health Organization or something. They made this film about basic hygiene and medicine and keeping things clean. Mm-hmm. And they were showing it to going all around the world, showing it to people. And they went to somewhere like Papua New Guinea where these people had never seen a film before, and they explained very carefully, look, here's this film, it's kind of transparent, we've got this light, we're going to put up the sheet, we're just going to shine through here and project the image, and they thought they'd explained it really carefully. And so the tribe sit and watch this thing, and as soon as this film is over, the tribe immediately get a big huddle, and there's this really fierce conversation, and the Western guys are like, what have we done? And eventually the chief comes out and says, what happened to the chicken? So what happened to the chicken? And it turns out that in the background of one of the shots there's a chicken, and then when they go back to that shot, the chicken's not there.
Ha-ha.
And you think, surely movies are, you just know how to watch them. No, you have to learn that. The whole the principle that things that are large in the foreground, are more important than things in the background. Like, for these guys, chicken ownership was important. If you stole a chicken, you would get a spear through you. Like this was a really important issue. A disappearing chicken. They were fantastically detail oriented, and their whole visual language was incredibly perceptive. But they hadn't learnt the Western conventions of the whole thing of here's a picture of someone, and here's another picture of someone else looking the other way. Like we're used to that. If that rule is broken, we notice it. But when it's obeyed, of not crossing the line, as it's called in editing terms. If there are two people and you draw a line between them, the camera always stays on one side of that line, ideally within about a 30-degree angle.
Yeah, that's how mathematically it is.
Yeah, and
more or less.
More or less. But if you look at confusing, like it's about action movies, when things are unclear and confusing and you don't really have an idea of the space, or you look at a really well done, even a very complex battle scene, like end of the first Lord of the Rings movie, where even though there's lots of things moving, you always know where they are relative to each other. That's very difficult to get right, and you spend a long time on set going through with script and continuity going, no, you've got to be looking up off the camera around here. And so there are lots of things that movies are very good at. Bizarrely, it was Jerry Lewis, the American comedian, who invented video playback. He was the first director to say, I don't want to have to wait till I see the rushes of this film to know how that shot went. I want to know straight away. So let's put a prism in the camera, let's put a video camera there. So when we're on set, we'll do a take, and then immediately I can see it on video playback and see how it goes. And the image quality isn't perfect, and there's no sound, but you know what's in shot. And there is no director on earth who does not have that benefit these days. You make a film, you can immediately go, oh, actually there was something in the background, or, you know what, it's quite a tight shot, that was kind of a big performance, you kind of look like you're overacting, can you just bring it down? In games, we don't get that, because the camera is the last thing that's added. So it's quite possible that the background and all the actors are created at totally different times on different continents, and if you're lucky, they will all go together. They will all match up. But the one thing that a director does in movies is to establish continuity of tone. They're not there to point the camera, they've got a director of photography for that. They're not there to place the lights, they've got a lighting director for that. It's their job to make sure the meaning of the piece is consistent. And there's no similar position in games. It's not writer-led and it's not director-led.
I mean, it's even worse in games in that sort of like sense, because in theatre, books and films and TV, you have a whole process defined, you have dependencies defined, and everything starts with that script. Like without that
the script is the primary source.
Exactly.
That then gets realised somehow.
And without that script, nothing works. And in games, there is not such thing. Like in games, you often ask yourself, for every game you start on, you often ask yourself, what will be the primary source information? And that will change throughout the process of the game, and it becomes to the point that you don't even necessarily trust that primary source information. So the idea, for example, of what we call the equivalent of a script would be what we call a game design document, right?
The dreaded GDD, yes.
And the joke on the GDD is the joke on the GDD is like you write it once, and you update it maybe 4 or 5 times, and then 3 months into it, it sort of like gets neglected because there's so much to do everywhere and the information is...
You can either do the work or document it, but there's no time to do both.
Exactly. But also, the information of how to implement things becomes so complex and specific to a person's job that you write 1,000 documents, and each are for their own sort of like tools and tool set, like, the texture people have got the way that the textures are sort of like done, and the texture pipeline, the level design, have got the level design pipeline and whatnot. So to find this coherent overview, like the script is doing, like the script's got everything that you need to make that movie, we don't have that. And that is something that we've been trying to solve for so many years, and I don't even know if it's solvable or not. But every time at the end of a project, it's been like this, oh, we got to solve this game design thing problem, because it's like at the end you just accept that within a team collectively, between all of you, the vision exists somewhere in all your brains.
I think it's a reason why a lot of game writers, even if they're at the kind of AAA. If that's not a term you're familiar with, dear listener, AAA kind of means the wannabe blockbuster, the kind of big action, the big selling games. Is even if you're working at that end of things in a particular genre of game, we tend to be very interested in the experimental stuff, because they're much more coherent works. They're made by small teams, sometimes 1 or 2 people, quite often it's one person. So it's a much more authored thing. There is one person in charge of it, and it's their vision that they've realised. And that games are always an uproar because the technology is obsolete every 6 months. So if we could just settle on one camera, if we could just decide, right, that's it, we're going to settle on one console, on one game engine, we did work out how to use them really, really well, and we could just concentrate on stories. Instead of which, in movie terms, we are always reinventing the film, the camera, the cinema, the seats, the screen. Everything's replaced all of the time.
Formatting of the screenplay, which font we use. I mean, that's the thing. Like, even in the screenplay, it's such... Like, the screenplay, it's such a common... The format is so common that you can even say, like, 1 page equals about 1 minute.
Yeah,
like in the screen, like the font is pretty much the same font. Like you can give that screenplay that you've written, if you follow the standards, to anyone working in the industry, and they will understand what to do with it. They can read it, they can get the information from it, and whatnot. If I were to give Ed like a game design document that I've written, he would probably have a lot of questions about that game design document in itself. Could be about the format, could be about like specifics in there, but it would require me also having a very long conversation and showing you all the details and all that stuff in order for you to make
I wouldn't know what it looked like. I wouldn't know what the tone was. Sorry, I was about to do colossal distraction. There was a great interview I heard with the producers of Game of Thrones. And they're, it's all going really well. They're delighted. It all seems to be working very well. And they get a phone call saying, "Call LA now." They're on location in Northern Ireland. I said, oh God, what is it? Is it, okay, I'm just passing you on to our head of durations. So, who? Never heard of this person. She says, "You are 17 minutes light." So, sorry? You have spent your budget and you are 17 minutes short of the agreed runtime for the whole series. What are you going to do? So, cast your mind back to Game of Thrones Season 1, and there's a big battle. There's a huge deal in the books. And at the beginning of it, just as it's about to begin, Tyrion Lannister is knocked unconscious. And at the end of it, he comes to... Now, in the book, he's awake through the whole thing and there's a huge battle. In the TV show, the battle is over and he wakes up at the end of it. That was going to be a big battle, but they had to cancel it because it was so expensive. And they went back through and they said, well, look, what have we got? We've got the locations. We've got this amazing cast. Who doesn't have a scene together in the book who really ought to have a scene together? And they are my favourite scenes in the whole first series. There's that great scene between Robert Baratheon and his wife Cersei Lannister, which isn't in the book at all, where they just sit down at a table and kind of just talk about, have this face-to-face thing about that. Did you ever love me? No. Like, was there ever a chance? Well, maybe at the beginning. And that's not in the book, but it's a wonderful scene. There's a great scene where Cersei's brother and one of Eddard Stark's men are guarding the king's chamber while he has sex with someone he shouldn't be having sex with. And,
as always.
Yeah, as always. And Ned's man, who's fought alongside this guy, is like, oh, right, we fought, and the other guy's having none of it at all. But what they had was, and that appeals to me as a games writer, is that they had a constraint. They said, okay, here's what we do have, and this is it's unusual because I'm full-time staff at Splash Damage. I'm there for the whole project. Most writers are brought in far too late on a project, and we have colleagues who have literally been told, okay, we've made the game what it is about. What's the story of it? Like, you never make a movie that way. Well, we've shot the action sequences, and we have all the sets and locations, but we don't know who the character... Oh, and here's the character art, but we don't know their names or what it is they do or why.
Or even the dialogue. Often what is as well, you walk in as a writer at the end, and they were like, no, everything's defined. All you need to do is touch up that dialogue, because clearly that makes a story. So, it's like because in the history of games, if you look at it, it's the idea of creating story and creating characters is very appealing to designers as well, creative directors. That's what I also want to do, like in games. Like in games, you want to create the game mechanics and everything else, but you also want to create a universe and characters and stories. So you think automatically, you as a creative director or lead designer of a game must do all these things. Well, really, what you must do is a little bit what the director does in film, actually exactly what the director does in film, like surround yourself with people who will know better than you and who can carry your vision across. Like, you are the vision holder, you hold that vision, so just be okay with it that you might not be the best writer, but that's okay, just find somebody who believes in your vision and write it. And, and the same with the DOP, and as you mentioned earlier, it's not on the director mustn't, it's not his. He doesn't need to know where to place the camera. He just needs to find someone who shares that vision and does it for him. In games, we often feel very in games we often feel very protected about the creative vision. Like it's really like, no, I'm the lead designer. You mustn't tell me what story I need to write. You mustn't tell me what colors I need to use.
But games,
I will decide.
Games are like the movies. If movies will run in a completely terrorized, dictator fashion by the costume department and the scenery department. Like, here are the costumes we're going to use. Yeah. This is the scenery. Yes. Right, who are the characters? Who are you going to put in this costume?
Run with it, yeah. And in the props department, because here's the scenery, and here's the gun that you will use for the rest of the for the duration of the film.
Yeah, and also to go back a bit to the whole scripts have a specific language and specific font, and you can deduce what time it's going to take and all of that. I think that's, first of all, that only sort of came into existence because all of film was monopolized by a small group of people in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Good on them!
Yes, and they've set the standard which the rest of the world is sort of trying to adhere to. But there's also outliers like TV series, for example, where the writers actually dictate the content of an episode right until the end of the episode being shot.
It's very odd. The director, I think it was a colossal wrong move by our culture. Cinema, there's a Canadian theorist called Marshall McLuhan, who I think 50% of what he said was rubbish, but some of it's fascinating. And he's very good at making phrases like the horseless carriage phase of a medium. And he says that basically that every new communication medium, goes through this horseless carriage phase where it's referred to and described in terms of the thing it's just replaced. So when the automobile comes along, it's like, oh, I get it, it's like a carriage with no horse. It's like, no, that's not what a car is. It's complete. If you're still thinking of it in terms of what a horse can do, you're missing the point. And so nobody took film seriously until it started supplanting theatre. And nobody took TV seriously until it started supplanting film. And the idea that film, and this is a thing that crops up all the time when people say, could games be art? Like, is this an art form? It's like, well, people said all this about television and film, and we've had these landmark films and TV series. Like, no one's questioning seriously whether whether the cinema can be a great narrative medium. I don't think it's automatically the case that games. Yes, of course. I mean, they could be. The question is, can art be games? Well, maybe. I don't know. Let's not get into that there. But in terms of, this is one of the things we'll be addressing in this course, is it's not just another medium.
Plugging.
Well, it's fascinating because no one really knows what works. It's still a frontier. We're still establishing what works and what doesn't. But the biggest issue is interactivity. All of these other media require, maybe passivity is not the right word, because when I read a novel, I'm actively engaged in it, but I can't change the story. Yeah. The story is set. If you and I read the novel, we'll react to it in different ways, but the same events unfold.
I always call it like an active and passive participant. You're still participating in the story, like in your mind. When you read a book, in your mind, you're making all these assumptions, or it stays with you, but you cannot influence anything. Like that's like the novel is written, the film's made. Like when you walk out of the cinema, the film still goes on, whatnot. But it's made. But with a game, it's like you have to actively participate in order to get that game moving. Like if I leave the controls, whatever, if I walk away, eventually the game will stop or it will go in a sort of like automation circle where
it's waiting for your input.
Because otherwise it doesn't know what to do. Which is the major difference, like interactive versus non-interactive. And I think that has been the biggest confusion and hindrance and that we have had in our industry is in like, we as game makers, we look at the other mediums like, oh, look what film has done, like with the visual language, or look what theatre's done with this. Look at all these things. We must take all the good bits and just directly plant them into games.
Because they'll work just as well, won't they?
Yeah, but that's how we ended up with.
Yeah, and it's a bit like the Hannibal Lecter factor of participating, because if you remember in the movies, he's completely chained up to some kind of cart or whatever, and he's being.
He's always
wheeled
contained.
around.
He's in a cell.
He's always contained, and he always has like a face mask. He cannot speak or interact or in any way. And in the movies, as a viewer, you're just shoved around without any possibility of interacting. You can still feel different things, but you'll just get shoved around and be forced to watch something.
But I like this. I mean, look,
and if you then let people out to interact, then it's a bit weird because you've been stuck in this stupid cart for ages. And all of a sudden, wait, hold on.
That's the problem.
I can save him from getting shot by, I don't know, terrorists or whatever. That's just weirhave
but that's the problem. That's not the problem with the audience. That's the problem with us not making this clear. And again, this is what Ed was referring to. We have got this big. If you would put it into a pile of experiments, right? We've got this big pile of experiments over the years in video games that clearly didn't work. Like the pile of stuff that we've tried collectively as an industry that didn't work is pretty huge, and we've got this other pile next to it of stuff that did work, which comparatively is very. It's you can look over it. But that's okay because we're still, games are still fairly young and they have developed very, very quickly in terms of technology, in terms of accessibility over the last 30 years, incredibly fast, to the point where we didn't even have time to take stock every now and then to see what worked and transform it and take it with us. Whenever something worked, and when Ed and I talked earlier, Ed made this great point about 10 years ago. There was a point within the tools of games where there was a point where everything was perfectly aligned, where there was one engine primarily used. The game developers knew how to use that engine, the tools, and
the company I work for, Splash Damage, started off as a mod team. We were amateurs, and we were using, at that point, everyone was using the Quake 3 engine. Lots of games were made using it, and it was very well understood. It was as powerful. The hardware hadn't caught up with it, but the software was really stable, and it was very well understood system. And everyone was using the same thing. And now it's so fractured, because now if you want to start making games, there's no way you can use a high-end system. Like if you want to use that's Unreal, which is a very good engine, but in order to use it at all, it's so complicated, and there's so many different. I mean, to go back to Quake 3, let's say I want to make a wooden box, the perennial cliche wooden crate in a game. Even I can make a 6-sided cube, the standard number of sides for a cube, and get a wood texture and slap it on there and render it. I'm not very good at it, but I could just about do it. Mm-hmm. And then when it switched to the next generation of engines, suddenly we had normal maps to give the illusion of detail, and there was physics and light and dynamic lighting and dynamic shadow casting. And suddenly, this thing that could be done by one person in 6 stages requires 6 specialist employees to do it. It's still just a wooden crate. It's not 6 times more fun. It's not, even the cube, the 3D cube, is not 3 times more fun than the 2D cube that you get in Mario, which is just a square that looks like, but we understand that it's a wooden crate. So really, the last 30 years in games there's been more and more graphical fidelity. Things are more lifelike. They've got more realistic physics. Sometimes they're in real time. It's like a physics experiment that plays out in real time. They're not necessarily more fun. Nothing is more fun than Tetris. There is no more engaging, immersive game than Tetris.
True, but on the other hand, you can just say, it's retro, and then make some crappy graphics and try to sell it as.
That's the really interesting thing about where games are at the moment. Is in movie terms, it's like. If you've got a mobile phone or a laptop that connects to the internet, you have been given a 1920s black and white hand-cranked silent camera. Congratulations, there. You can now make a movie. You have the physical, to make a game 20 years ago, you needed rooms full of equipment that was really expensive and couldn't do anything else. Same as with making music. Recording studios used to be buildings, not laptops. And then it went from, you need building full of machinery. Now you need a rack-mounted unit. Now it's just you need a computer can do that. Now it's a plug-in for an app on your laptop.
Or now in this case, not even a computer can
or
do
not even a computer.
Just a cell phone,
biggest
really.
Difference, but the thing about it is even film, TV, all these things, and even music, making your own album, all these things, the technology is a point where it's very accessible. The same with games. Making games technology forward is actually very accessible. And but the difference is, though, the major difference is with film and theatre and all this other stuff, and even making music, there was this period where it wasn't very accessible. You probably only had 1 or 2 tool set, but what it helped to do is help define the workflow and how to solidify those ideas, how to learn the craft rather than learn the tools. And with games, it always has been like either you had to write your own engine, or you use an expensive engine, or different engines. It's like what Ed was referring to. Like for each game, there was a different camera, like 36mm, 37mm, 35mm. But the problem is now these days. So I personally find like games to be the making very accessible, but that's from a tools point of view. The craft of making games is very much often still in an experimental phase. There is no. We don't have the equivalent of if you have a 3-act structure, then people will understand that. So we don't have that. We have got let's just we want to make this sort of like game. We've got this like tool set. Well, we've got a few experienced people here. Let's try to make it. But there's no recipe that.
No, which is weird because games are often, the complaint is that they're so formulaic.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's such a risky, chaotic process that certainly if I was investing someone else's money, I'm kind of, as one of the, well, everyone's creative at the company, but, usually I'm there saying, no, let's try something different. If I was a producer, I'd be saying, no, let's do what people already like. And let's make, is it going to be a completely original vision, or is it going to be kind of a cliche and a stereotype? Oh, wait, no, everyone knows what that cliche looks like. We can agree on that. That's a bigger target to hit for the team.
Yeah.
Let's take some other risk. Let's not take this risk.
But you still got this thing, even if you copy exactly the same idea often of like hardware changing quite a lot, you still have that problem. Like, okay, you've got this this game that I wrote 2 years ago or 4 years ago won't necessarily work. I can't make it work for the hardware that's out these days easily. It's not like I can just like literally take it and just throw it on there. Like, it starts to become a possibility, but there used to be a time where like I've got this, I can't make the same game for different platforms for whatever reason. So it's been like, it's a weird thing. Like, we're trying to do everything at once in the games industry. Like, we're trying to make everything work at once. We're trying to find creative processes that work whilst we're trying to like keep up with technology. It's this weird. It's really chaotically confusing, but very interesting at the same time. I'm not trying to diss games because I love making games, but the things that games are really good at, maybe that's the stuff also to highlight of. Like, one of the things which has been mentioned earlier was interactivity, and for me, the interactive part is such a big draw in games. Like, it just immerses me. Like, the way games immerse me is like unlike any other medium, and it's not a replacing thing. Like, for me, games don't replace films or TV. It's a complement. They complement each other. As in, example, I'm either in the mood to play a game or watch a movie or a TV show. I'm not like, none of this is replacing, because there's a different type of investment when I play a game. Like, the classic situation that you can do in games is I can put the player in front of a choice that they can't back out of. I can, for example, say you can either save the world or you can only save your family, but you can't have both. And I can make you make that choice that you see in big movies where the hero is put into, it's been an impossible choice, and somehow they're going to figure out third choice, and you just sit there waiting for that to happen because you wouldn't want to be in that position. I'm being put in that position, and it's as thrilling, but also sometimes, like, sometimes you don't want to be put in the position. Sometimes you do. It's a choice. So for me, it's a totally different choice of entertainment.
It's the one thing that interactive media can do, is it makes you implicit in a sense. And there was a very successful, I don't know if it was successful, but a very impressive game came out, was it last year, called Papers, Please?
It's very successful.
Which is deliberately a very crude visual style. It's very, very blocky, it's very... And you play the part of a border agent checking papers. There are lots of refugees coming through. It's miserable. Some people, some terrorists are trying to come through with fake papers. And you're in a horrible position whereby you are denying people access just in case they are not, they're not authentic.
They haven't got the right paperwork.
And you are just a cog in a machine. You are just, you are a functionary. And it's completely changed the way I look at queues of people with passports. But it's not just a document, in a way that a documentary about passport agents would never do, because it's been me turning them down.
Yeah.
I've been saying, yeah, you're fine, come on through, or no, you can't, and I've ruined their lives. That's a thing that we can empathise with someone. We could have a character and we kind of identify. It could be a documentary. We could have identified with someone's position, but we can't be in their position. And what games can do is give you a version of oh no, you did that. Not a character you identify with. You yourself took that action and made that choice.
And
So
Papers, Please...
it's a bit more than interactive movies from the 90s.
Yeah, but I mean, Papers, Please is specifically interesting, going back to that very briefly, because Papers, Please gives you a set of rules. Like, here's a set of rules, like, people with these passports, they can get in without a visa. People with those passports need a visa. You always check the expiry date and whatnot. So you get this set of rules like every day. You play it per day, and every day those rules get more complicated as this border agent. And you have to, based on the rules and based on the papers that you get from the people like coming to the border crossing, you have to then deny or accept the entry request. But then you also get, on top of that, you also get sometimes these hidden messages from people like, please help me, please don't let that person behind me through because he's trying to do something bad. And the person behind that person has got the right papers, so you have to let them through. Because what happens if you do not follow those rules, you do not get paid. And if you do not get paid, what happens then, there's this other side of that game where you have to look after your family. You have to pay rent, you have to pay medicine, you have to pay all these things.
Because a lot of games started off as puzzles, as toys, and there was an optimal outcome. You could win them, you could beat them, you could solve the puzzle, and that was it. It was like you were looking around for the right key, and you turn it, and the door is unlocked, success. That's not how the world works.
No.
And some of the most interesting game work is being done. I'm thinking particularly of a designer called Brenda Romero, who used to be called Brenda Brathwaite, and she's fascinated with the potential of games to model unjust systems, which is that's not what we tend to turn to for entertainment, but to really understand. And so there's a very moving talk. If you get the opportunity to, if you Google, her name was Brenda Brathwaite at that point, and she made a game called Train, which I will not spoil. But there's an hour-long GDC talk that someone films. I watch it every 6 months or so, and it always knocks me out. And the question was, could a game ever make you cry? And I'm in floods of tears just listening to her describe the making and the design of that game. But she has children who are mixed race, and one of them came back to, what did you study at school today? Oh, it was African American History Month. And they'd clearly learnt a couple of phrases, but nothing about the reality of slavery had sunk in. So she made a game. She said, okay, well, here we go. Here's a boat, and here's a sea, and we're going to take people from over here, and you roll a dice to see how far you go across the sea, and you use this much food per turn. And of course, you get halfway through, and the wind dies, or you do not make enough progress, and you run out of food. It says, well, what are you going to do? You've got to feed these people, or what? And the look on her child's face as she didn't realise, it's that implicit, it wasn't just, you see someone in an awkward situation. The full force of that hit them. Yeah. There are very, very few people making games which I think are educational in that wider sense of, that's what that's like. I think quite often we refer, it's really hard. It's very challenging making games. It's hard enough to portray any sort of reality, even a fictional, conventional action hero story, which we know how those go. The definition of an action movie is the hero survives, but you don't know how. You can't imagine how. And they're ingenious, or they're brave, or they and you can use coincidence to get your hero into trouble, but you shouldn't use that to get them out of trouble. They've got to be resourceful and brave. And there's a lot of work has gone into theory over the decades about what the rules of a Western-style story are. It's really interesting watching films that don't come from that tradition. Like, if you watch Indian religious cinema, or a lot of kung fu movies. There's not kung fu movies. There's a movie called Ip Man about the founder of which just has no suspense in it at all, because he's a human god. This guy is the founder of Wing Chun, and he's just a better fighter than anyone else, and he just wins all the time. And it's kind of boring because he's perfect. He has no doubts. He has no fears. He always wins, and it's clear that he's going to win. There's never any moment of here we are. It's Saving Private Ryan. I'm pretty sure most of these people survive, but I'm not quite sure. Or who knows who survives or doesn't. There's no suspense at all. He wins. Yeah. But it's a different tradition of drama where it's the enactment of a moral story. Indian religious movies as well. They're not about is this mythical character going to be the other? Everyone knows the story. In fact, there's a whole subset of stories. The problem is trying to make those situations dramatic where you know the ending. This is true of Bible stories. Or the first Superman film, which was written by Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, who's a very skilled dramatist. What do you do when your hero has the powers of a god? How on earth do you make that tense? Because the one thing he can't do is be in two places at the same time. Mm-hmm. So Lex Luthor, the perfect antagonist, makes him choose between saving most of America. You know, there are two bombs, one on each seaboard of America. Mm-hmm. And he can save Los Angeles or he can save his girlfriend, but he can't do both. And then he, in a very characteristic way, manages to do both, which is why he's a superhero, because he can imagine
things. Does he go back in time or something? Well,
yeah, it turns out if you just make the Earth spin the other way, you reverse time, which is, of course, physics nonsense, but it's emotionally perfect, which is why people bought it, is that, oh, that's right, he's a superhero. He's not just brave and resourceful. He does things we're not capable of. He conceives of things we're not capable of. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to make a story, because it's really interesting watching when it doesn't work. So there are some rules, many of these rules are obvious as soon as they've been pointed out, but when they don't work, they just sink the story. For example, classic Western story structure, and a lot of people have written about this in great detail. So you start off with a protagonist who is in stasis. They're in some kind of comfortable, or at least a stable situation. And they have some kind of fear, loss, block or wounds that keeps them where they are. And then they are forced into action by an inciting incident, which usually happens pretty early on. And they're forced to act. And there's something that they need, and they need to do it straight away, and something is stopping them from doing that. And it's a really simple test as a writer. Like, if you don't know what your character wants, why they have to do it straight away, and what's stopping them, nothing is happening. Yeah. It's just talk. And I think it's particularly a problem for writers who love dialogue and people saying clever things, is you have these empty pages. They're a lot of fun to write, but there's no drama because, and just a simple rule, and I didn't used to think this was true, if the power relationship between your characters at the end of the scene is the same as at the beginning, nothing has happened. Mm. And it's a big problem for games because we tend to have to write very exposition-heavy things where two characters who know these things in the heart say, oh, hello, it's you again. Don't you think these things about this stuff that's just happened? Why, yes, I do. And I think it's a problem for all costume drama, is how do you explain the world? When, people don't, when you meet someone you know, they don't remind you who they are. Oh, hi, it's me, your father. I gave birth to you, and you're this old, and we've grown up here.
That's you, damn it.
So the number of stories, like Harry Potter, where you get a stranger who's brought into a new world and acts, and we experience the new world through them, and things are explained to them. I mean, games, writing tutorials for games, or writing the first level of a game.
It's the weird thing. I've started doing this with writing tutorials and writing the thing. It's the first thing I do and the last thing I do, and then I do one version at the beginning that is always shit. Like, without fail, the first tutorial I write is always shit. Like, it's just even for design is always shit. But I've done it, so I know what doesn't work, so I can go back to it at the very end. But the thing that you said with the exposition, I think games have this problem over the years. What they have been is very exposition heavy, and exposition heavy means like force feeding the player all the information rather than this being an interactive medium, making it so that the player connects the dots themselves. And it comes often from that love of writing is exposition, like the thought that writing is exposition only, which it isn't. Like writing for games is more setting up, a lot of setup, a lot of sort of like, you can write about everything and anything and define everything apart from the protagonist, which you shouldn't write because the player is going to play that part. And
bad games and bad drama leave nothing for the player or viewer
to imagine. Yeah. But games are particularly. I mean, games used to have this thing where, for example, there are still games out there without naming names where you have cutscenes that last for hours and they
quick
don't.
Time events.
Yeah, but they don't even necessarily help to the story. Like the most powerful games that I've played were the ones where I, as the player, was figuring the stuff out that happened, where I was connecting the dots, and at the end, at the end, the game was confirming it, and that power when you try to put the dots together in terms of exposition, at the end, it all comes. The big moment happens, and you realise what the fuck is going on. If it's done in a way where it's not force-fed to you, where the realization comes to yourself as a player, and it's supported by the game a little bit, are so blimmin' powerful. It's
and
just
because you
intense.
made it happen yourself.
Exactly.
There's
And then-
agency.
And no big speech that you normally get in movies or in books. This big sort of like all-solving, all-pointing speech has that power in that moment in games.
True, but it's very tough to get right because I remember
course it is.
from Shopkeeper, as you probably can remember as well.
I remember this
where,
game, yeah.
Yes, because it was completely void of exposition. It
Yeah.
was intentionally
There's-
lacking any kind of exposition whatsoever. The only exposition it had was where you could look at the notes, like there was a kind of hint system where you could look at the notes that one of the characters had written down about every piece of the game.
But I think
that's the only thing.
it's
And
why things end up being so
Bond.
overt is that you think you're being kind of fruitfully ambiguous. It's like, no, it's just boring. It's just blank.
Yeah.
But
Exactly, and it's people just didn't understand what it was about, essentially.
Or there are genre expectations. Like for a role-playing game, people expect they kind of want a lot of lore and backstory. And one of the things they enjoy about that genre is finding out about that world.
Yeah.
And that's not really a thing for shooters, for example. People are quite impatient. They want to blow things up and run on. So games like BioShock, where
Amazing.
which I mean are fascinating games, and they've had a problem where they have to work as action films. You have to be able to run around and shoot things. And thematically, they've been getting further and further away from that. And the kind of writerly parts of them are increasingly contradicted by the action parts of them. And I don't know if there's any better solution. I think the first two are amazing, and the third one's really interesting. I just don't know how it's possible. But nobody is asked to make the same film again and again and again. They might want a sequel, but
But for
tell
me,
it to
I mean,
Michael Bay.
No, but for me, look, this is for me.
okay, he does make the same film again and again.
But for me,
Yeah,
this is why Portal is such a fantastic game, because Portal, the game mechanics are really nicely tied into the narrative and vice versa, and it works in tandem together. There is like the way where the game plays, the location, the setup, the narrative, what you have to do as a player, and the game mechanics.
But it's a unique setting. I mean, it took.
But yes, it is
it's perfect. Where else? What other possible setting is there where the story is only advanced by the player's interactions? Like, the problem is, all games, we try and disguise it as best we can, but all narrative games are basically a menu system. If you do this, then this happens.
Yeah, but that's.
How do we disguise the buttons? How do we make it feel like you're
Go
not
to
just
page
solving
Yeah,
a
but
puzzle?
Ed, I think that's.
But that's it. It's like you make a game about solving puzzles.
But that's
it's
which
genius.
is true. It's true, but again, that's. I mean, I don't think Portal is the only solution to. Like, it's the only possible example. Like, it's the only great one at the moment that I can think of that I love as a first-person like narrative with game mechanics and everything. It's the one that I love. BioShock for me is second close because it does a lot of things well, but I also agree with like the shooting thing in a way. But however, to their credit, a lot of the other game mechanics like the plasmids and all that stuff is really nicely tied into the narrative and also to the main narrative. It's just genuinely this. But the setup that you have to go around shooting things because they've all gone crazy, you can see that they had to put that in order to make kind of like sense of the shooting.
Well, but that's the game.
That
Like,
is
the game,
exactly. That's the thing.
Yeah.
But I was referring to this, and I'm going to let Tom talk in a second. But I was referring to this.
I bet you're not.
There was this one game I really loved, it's Jagged Alliance, and I've mentioned it to you.
Yes.
And it's like it's a round-based isometric strategic game in the 90s, and it's basically this thing where you have to select a lot of soldiers and mercs in order to do missions. And it's a usual thing where it's round-based, so each soldier and merc, they've got different properties and different skills, and depending on the mission, you pick and choose them for the right skill sets, But also, each character has got character traits, and each character is voiced. And you get this brilliant situations where, for example, you put two characters together that are from countries that hate each other, and instead of you tell them to go and do things, and instead of doing that, they start shooting each other because they hate each other so much. Or you put a guy or another guy is afraid of the dark, so you do like night missions, and he just runs away. But that dynamic was an amazing dynamic. Like that game was for me still one of the best strategy games because it wasn't it wasn't random because it told you what characters didn't like. At the same time, it had this sense of surprise, and also it gave you the sense of character. It was this thing, like it had rules. It also broke them, but it wasn't random because it was part of the fun was figuring out what you could do and what you couldn't.
And the complexity was intuitive because it was on human. It wasn't. Here's an alien race you've never heard of.
Exactly.
And they are vulnerable to this chemical you've never heard of, but they get straight like
kryptonite.
Well, exactly. But that notion of that's what we used to describe it. Like, you're really powerful, but there's this one thing that can destroy you. Kryptonite. But that's understandable on a human scale. Like, I get it. There's one poison that works on him. That I get. And a problem for games when they are trying to be original is to make them intuitive enough that you go, I get it. Like the number of games that rely on fire, like elemental things, like wind, like earth, wind, fire, just because it makes sense. We understand. I get it. This is a fire enemy. I'm not going to be able to do any damage with a fire weapon.
Yeah.
But if I use water, I would. That's strong and intuitive if you are familiar with that kind of narrative philosophy.
I think you can even see this in games like Civilization. For example, Civilization, that game makes so much sense. And the narrative in there is also a lot of cultural heritage in there. For example, if you say, hey, I want to build a world of, build a wonder of the world, build the pyramids. Like, I totally understand what that means. Like, build a pyramid, like, I know enough about the pyramid to know that this is monumental tasks. And if my civilization builds a pyramid, I know what that means. That's a great achievement. Now take the whole game mechanics, copy those game mechanics, take them into space, right? And the scenario you've mentioned as well. And suddenly, you must build the googly-boo of googly-boo. You have no idea what that means. Even though that people die with this. You have no sensibility. And in fact, there was a space civilization, the version in space coming of Civilization. Wasn't there like a few months, like a year ago? Civilization?
Yeah, the new Civilization, the space
yeah,
civilization.
And I
essentially
love the
Alpha
mechanics.
Centauri, the new
I love the mechanics in there, and a big Civ fan. And it's
Beyond
mostly
Earth.
beyond this. Yeah. For me, it's the mechanics that drives that for most, but I still have no idea what half the emotional connection to a lot of the stuff that is mentioned in that version isn't as strong as the original Civilization.
And this is
also, we should touch on Alpha Centauri, which was one of the best strategy games with a story. Yeah. Because they managed to introduce the concept of, it's not about nations, which is a concept you already know, but it's about philosophies and different characters leading these different colonies.
That is true, actually. I think they went around it that way.
And they actually had a story running from the beginning with different events leading through the entire strategy game, which is very unusual for any game.
It was amazingly coherent.
Yes.
But it's really worth touching on these examples because one of the main functions in a team of a narrative designer is to provide context for the mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And you could look at games as just bins of mechanics. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting to look at books that concentrate purely on design in those ways. There's an excellent book called Level Up by Scott Rogers, who's a very experienced game designer. And he does things like list the 8 kinds of enemies in a 2D platform game. And you think, come on, there's got to be more than 2. Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, okay, I guess they are all variants of that. These are mechanics. These are the things that players like developing mastery and demonstrating relative skill at jumping around platforms and timing jumps. And here's a thing, here's an enemy that teleports behind you or attacks from distance or explodes straight away or explodes after a delay. Coming up with because one of the things I spend a lot of time doing is writing briefs for artists trying to explain that mechanic. Like, okay, we have an opponent, they have a certain ability, they have a strength, they have a weakness, and you've got to do half the job for them. Like, it's their job is to draw it, but you can't just say, come up with an enemy that does that. You say, well, okay, so they're big and they're powerful, but they're slow, or maybe they're giant, or they're a dinosaur, or something. The first list you write is rubbish and full of terrible cliche, but you've got to write it down to clear your head. Yeah. Because you need to write something that somebody can draw, and then someone can see once and know exactly, just intuit, I get it. And then the animators are going to do stuff. This is what's so challenging for writers who are used to working with prose, and you realise what an amazing, powerful narrative device prose is. I tell writers trying to do that, right, okay, your verbs are limited by the buttons on the controller, your adverbs are all done by the animators, and your adjectives are all done by the 2D artists. Yeah. You have to completely outsource all of that and be clear and be able to write clear instructions and design documents for people to do that. And there are so many great literary characters that exist. I was thinking of an author like Dickens, where sometimes characters are just they're just described by their waistcoat or their whiskers or something.
Yeah.
And they're really alive. You read them and go, oh, I bet that guy's just like that. You can't do that with a game design. You've got to be able to draw it and animate it if it's a game that's inspired that way.
And it's the mechanics as well. I think that's the context for the mechanics. I mean, there's this famous. There's this thing like because game mechanics are all based on rules essentially, because it's a game. It's a video game. It runs on a computer, and it all needs to be broken down to rules. So
it's a very determinist. There are some games where it kind of happens in front of you, but generally. There's input from the player and it affects an outcome. And there is a discrete binary outcome, whether it's a win or a lose, or just, it's ended up this way instead of that way. That's the loosest system that still describes a game.
Yeah, and you can often, as a game designer, what you often do as a systems designer, you actually design those rules in Excel or in a spreadsheet, because you have the formulas in there. You can put your formulas in there. You can put the input values in there. At the end, you get some values out, and those values have different meanings. And what you have to do then is take that and put that into context, as Ed was referring to, and that context is what then makes the game what it is at the end. It's like all the different things combined. And Ed mentioned earlier the term narrative designer. So in games, the writer traditionally was pulled in very late. Like when the game's sort of like nearly done, the idea of the writer was to come in and provide a little bit of dialogue in order to make everything cohesive. Great, which of course isn't how it all works.
Too late.
Too late, exactly. That's often the thing. Too late, too much stress. So, and the idea of the writer would ask, can I change some characters? No, you can't change any characters. Can I add some animation? You can't do anything. You must just write these pieces of dialogue. So over the last few years, there's this new term has emerged called a narrative designer, which a narrative designer is more involved with the actual making of the game. The idea is that they start from the beginning. They are
there with the team the whole time.
The whole time.
The design team.
And they're not just writing, they also help with the design, with the game mechanics and everything, just to understand, just to be able to cohesively create a world, from a writer's perspective as well, that fits together. The irony is, of course, that as a narrative designers, you could say it's equivalent of somebody writing a script, or like a screenplay, because they also do that from the very beginning. So it's kind of weird that we had to create this special term for something that a writer should be given the permission to do anyway, because then they would do a better job. Then they would do the job that they're meant to be doing.
A lot of what it comes down to is actually organisation design and team design, and it's how much power a writer has. So in movie terms, you're not just writing the script, or you're not just writing the dialogue of the script. You're also a director and a producer and the production manager and the prop maker and the scenery guy and it's not just writing. It's not just the disciplines involved are much more various. So you need to be able to speak to coders. You need to be able to understand the language of concept artists. Otherwise, you'll write. I mean, the classic problem is writers are primarily readers. We are inspired by words. Artists don't work that way. So one of the biggest problems for writers is how do you get the rest of the team to read your work? The best answer to which I had is you laminate it and you put it in the toilets at the company, because there's nothing. That's the one time their attention is not distracted elsewhere.
That's why it's called splash damage.
Oh,
And Tom destroyed it all.
he went there.
He killed the podcast.
He destroyed it. There's no podcast left.
So George, anything else?
I don't think I can follow up with anything after that.
Making a toilet joke about splash
all
damage.
all I can say is this: making games is pretty awesome. It's very hard work. It's very, very awesome. And if you want to write for games, if writing for games is a thing, writing isn't just a thing where you put down words on the paper. It's understanding the whole process of making a game as well. And only if you do that, you'll be able to participate in a way where you will make a difference. Because as a writer, it's first of all making your case for not being brought in the end, but it's also making it's understanding the game development process and making yourself valuable from the begining. And as Ed mentioned, you have to be able to understand all the different processes.
You've got to add value to every department.
Yes, and it's possible, and a lot of the great writers who including Ed, and a lot of the great minds, but a lot of the great writings in games. But like, for example, like Portal is again a great example where the writing really complemented the game mechanics and vice versa, and that's because people work together there as well from the beginning, I think, as well. So. And so writing is great.
But I think the most important thing is Twine. There is a very simple. You can make a game. This is the most important thing. If you can type, you can make a game. It won't necessarily have any graphics in it, but that's not important. You can create a world. There will be player input, or they choose between some options you've written, and this leads to other outcomes. And there are amazing games being made in Twine. There is one called Horse Master, which is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing stories I have ever read. Please go. It's just, and they're free to play, because everyone makes them the same way. You can see how they've made it. It's like, oh, that movie was cool, and you get to see the footage, you get to see how they edit it, you can take it apart and see how it works. I'd recommend everyone make a small bad game in Twine, because you'll learn more from finishing that than you will thinking about writing something else.
Yeah. And that's it. I think Tom's now waving it at people. So
he's just waving at random now.
He's waving at random.
Tom's going to throw us out.
He just waved at himself.
Yeah, I think our brain downloads for this hour has been completed.
Brain download completed.